incisive cornet phrases could only belong to Leon Bix Beiderbecke, legendary American jazz musician of the 1920s. His highly inventive improvisations with groups like this one, led by saxophonist Frankie Trumbar, have earned Bix a permanent place in jazz history. Bix's hometown was Davenport, Iowa, where he was born in 1903 into a comfortable middle-class family of German origin. By the age of 7, he was labelled a prodigy for his abilities at the piano. He turned to the cornet at 15, and after playing with high school and college bands, he graduated onto the professional jazz scene with various small groups, including Trumbars. At the height of his power as a jazz musician, he joined the orchestra of Paul Whiteman, known in his day as the King of Jazz. Bix stayed with Whiteman only 2 years, but in that time he recorded some of his best work. He left the band in 1929 when, sadly, his alcoholic habit got the better of him. He died in 1931 of pneumonia, compounded by drink. Artistic genius and an early death have always been a surefire guarantee of legendary status. Bix was no exception. The myths have clung to him as persistently as his followers have tried to emulate his playing. One of Bix's most ardent devotees today is Richard Sudhalter, American journalist and himself a cornetist in the Bix mold. For 15 years, Sudhalter has collected material about his hero for eventual publication in this book, a definitive biography called Bix, Man and Legend. During his researches, Sudhalter unearthed many of the original orchestrations used by Paul Whiteman when Bix was a member of the band. So that Whiteman's music could be heard again live after so many years of neglect, Sudhalter formed the New Paul Whiteman Orchestra, a group of English instrumentalists sympathetic to the popular styles of the 20s and 30s. These rehabilitated Whiteman scores reveal the enormous influence of Bix on the orchestra, and therefore on the way popular music was to develop during the next quarter of a century. To trace the main threads in Bix Beiderbecke's musical career, I talked to Richard Sudhalter in his London home. When did Bix actually first hear jazz, and what was its impact on him?
As close as we can gather, it first happened when his brother came home from what they called then the Great War. The elder brother had been a soldier. He'd never gotten further than a base somewhere in the South. I forget where it was. But with his severance pay from the armed forces, he came home with a gramophone and a pile of records, one of which was Tiger Rag by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which he duly played in the course of things at home, and which turned out to be the only record of the lot which interested his younger brother, sufficiently so that young Bix appropriated it, played it until it was white with wear. I remember tone arms in those days weighed, 3 tons and had steel needles at the end, so a record didn't stand much of a chance of lasting long. But before you knew it, he'd come by an old cornet and was teaching himself elementary fingerings, and, crouching there in front of the horn of the gramophone, just blasting away,
What was the response of Bix's family to his taking up jazz?
His parents didn't want him involved in jazz. They didn't want him involved in professional music. No fit life for a gentleman. You've heard it before. And being second-generation Germans, both of them, and being very, very tuned in to the whole kind of German-Austrian romantic tradition, they didn't want to countenance the fact that their boy was becoming more and more involved in music played in brothels, in bars, on riverboats, in places where people of the other social orders, such as they were, gathered. And because of that, there was a lot of opposition.
What was the first band he formed?
Well, the first band was really an assembly of young musicians from around the Chicago area, some of them college boys, all of them fired with a love of music and wanting to play. Eventually, a job at a roadhouse in Ohio near Cincinnati afforded them the opportunity to get together as a band. They called themselves the Wolverine Orchestra of Chicago, which was a name that sprang from the fact that one of the staples of their repertoire at the beginning was Wolverine blues, and they played it till the cows came home, and finally somebody said, well, why don't you call yourselves the Wolverines? It's as good a name as any. They, as many of the early pioneer jazz groups, made their first records for the Jeanette label, which was a division of the Star Piano Company in Richmond, Indiana. and constituted really just a very, very primitive studio in a back room of the piano factory. It also was located next to a railroad track, and all the pulleys and gears and clanking bits of equipment and everything would grind to a sudden halt every time a train came by, because obviously, you know, the sound of the train would shake the building and shake the equipment and knock the styly out of the grooves and every other thing. And I suspect quite a few takes were spoiled. It was not electric recording. It was all done with, you know, with horns and diaphragms and all the things that accompanied recording back in those early days.
Is it one of those recordings that you've used in order to recreate the group that we're seeing in the studio?
We wanted to recreate less the group itself. The instrumentation of our little group is slightly different from that of the Wolverines. We use a bass sax instead of a tuba and so on. Then an approximation of the kind of sound the Wolverines got. We've chosen a tune called Big Boy, which is a pop tune in 1924. It was actually recorded not in Richmond, but at Jeanette's New York studio, which presumably was more modern and more jazzy and streamlined than the one in Indiana. Judging from the sound of the records, it was pretty much all of a piece. But in any case, I think Big Boy, while not an attempt to imitate the record in any way, should give you an overall idea of what that kind of band sounded like, especially with Bix piloting it.
How committed was Bix to that kind of unconstrained, freewheeling jazz that the Wolverines played? Was he intellectually committed to it?
In the early days, yes. I think as a young man of 20, 21, which he was at the time these records were made, all he really cared about was playing, having a good time, playing improvised music. It was really a very happy-go-lucky existence, you know, blue skies and wheat fields and or whatever grows out there in the Midwest, you know. And a very abandoned feeling, which was not really Chicago and wasn't New York or any of the very popular pigeonholes in which jazz critics tend to view early jazz. It was just the way young musicians, white musicians in this case, played out in the Midwest, in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Nebraska, Kansas.
Once Bix had moved to a wider musical environment like Chicago, how quickly did his fame spread?
Well, among musicians, very fast. People all over the states, Boston, you know, towns, cities, and far-reaching as that, or California, and all of them, knew of him, knew there was somebody about who was worth listening to. And as soon as the Wolverines records became circulated widely, you had musicians, cornet players, trumpet players, all over the place trying to absorb what he was doing. The general public was another story. Even at the height of Bix's popularity and fame and success, I suppose you could say, musically, the general public at large didn't really know much about him. Because jazz was not considered an art music the way it is now. You know, it was really just one segment of popular music. There was one guy in every band who was the hot man. He stood up and played, you know, he got off, whatever the quaint phrase of the time was. But, you know, Bix was really very much an inside guy for musicians.
Did he have many offers of work? Was he specifically invited to join groups?
For a while, no, because one of the things that hampered him was the fact that he couldn't read very well at that point. I mean, he didn't really become a competent reader until he joined Paul Whiteman quite a while later. At the beginning, in fact, when he left the Wolverines, he went with Gene Goldkat's orchestra in late '24, and was immensely popular, especially with the jazz contingent in the band.
What kind of group was Gene Goldkat's?
Largely a kind of commercial dance band on the face of it, but with a very heavy saturation of jazz-influenced people. This was true actually even more when Bix finally joined the orchestra on a permanent basis in 1926, and by that time had in it all sorts of people, including the arranger Bill Chalice, who immediately appreciated what Bix had to say and began to mold the orchestra's sound around it.
After the Gene Goldkat Orchestra, what was the next important step in Bix's career?
Well, in late October 1927, both he and Frankie Trumbar joined Paul Whiteman, who had been really after them for quite some time. It's perhaps worth noting about Whiteman at this point that the title King of Jazz was conferred on him. He didn't invent it. He was, above all else, a very canny, very shrewd businessman, an orchestra leader who knew taste, who knew the taste of his public, knew how to reach a lot of people, and I think above all recognized musical excellence when he saw it. And he always liked to keep a few jazz musicians in the band, and when Bix and Trumbar became free, as it were, you know, he went after them. He offered them good money, and finally they accepted and joined him at the end of October.
What proportion of the music played by the Whiteman Orchestra was jazz, in whatever form, solo or group ensemble? What proportion was arranged?
I think you can probably say that jazz was one facet of a pretty kaleidoscopic musical output. I mean, Whiteman, as the biggest thing in show business at that time, and 30-piece orchestra and all the trappings, you know, had a number of audiences to please, and he was able to turn the trick of keeping everybody happy at the same time. So therefore, some part of every evening, whether a section or spread out all over the evening, was devoted to the efforts of, say, for example, Bix, Trumbar, the Dorsey brothers. Chalice, by this time, was working for Whiteman as one of his staff arrangers. And the same thing, to an extent, happened that started to happen with Goldkat as well, that that end of the Whiteman Orchestra's output, concerned with jazz, was fashioned after, modeled, shaped around Bix's way of playing the cornet. I mean, he was the touchstone for the entire thing, really.